Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Rabbi Julie Roth, and this is my 14th academic year as the Executive Director of the Center for Jewish Life. And it's my honor to welcome all of you to the fifth and final memorial lecture in memory of our teacher and dear friend and family member, Rabbi Jim Diamond. As most of you know, Rabbi Jim Diamond served as the Executive Director of the Center for Jewish Life before I came, and one of his main achievements was to bring together under one roof a very diverse community that before the opening of the Center for Jewish Life 25 years ago had been located and dispersed in different parts of campus. And as I've watched these 5 lectures unfold over the years, I think that they too bring together diversity under one roof. But in this case, they've brought together the diverse intellectual and musical interests that Rabbi Jim Diamond had under the rubric of memory and community. And so over these years, we've studied Talmud, we've had classical musical concerts, and now we'll be exploring Rabbi Diamond's love for Jewish literature, and in particular, the work of Agnon. I wanted to give thanks to those who organized tonight's lecture. There's been a committee over the 5 years, as well as staff at the Center for Jewish Life, and this year in particular, Baruch Saul from Judaic Studies. I want to turn the program over in a moment to Jim Diamond's son, Eitan, who will speak a little bit more about his memory and tonight's lecture in particular. But I just want to honor that part of Jim's legacy was intellectual. He was somebody who was living and growing, learning and teaching his whole life. And part of his legacy was friendship and community. And I think one beautiful things about this lecture series is that it has drawn together people who have known and cared about Jim from so many different corners of his life, family from Canada and the United States, current students, past students, faculty members, students from classes he taught in the community, and friends. And so it's wonderful that we can all be here together tonight. And now please join me in welcoming Eitan Diamond.
So welcome to the 5th annual Rabbi Jim Diamond James S. Diamond Memorial Lecture. Should read my notes better. My name is Eitan Diamond. I do have the privilege of opening today's session and introducing our guest speaker, Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs. In the aftermath of, oh no, you can't hear me. I will speak louder. How was that? In the aftermath of my father's tragic death, my mother and her friends decided to create this lecture series to memorialize my father's many interests. And over the past 5 years, they have definitely succeeded in doing this. Rabbi Sachs's lecture today on Shai Agnon follows previous presentations by Ruth Calderon on the Talmud, Ruth Gavison on Israeli politics, my cousin Debbie Diamond's classical music lecture and performance, and last year's presentation on the changing American Jewish landscape by Professor Stephen M. Cohn. Had there been a decision to extend the lecture beyond the 5 years, I have no doubt that we could have gone on for many more, exploring my dad's varied interests in poetry, Canadian-American relations, what it means to be a rabbi, egalitarianism in Jewish life, the Jewish college student scene, hockey, baseball, vegetarianism, tomato gardening, and exercising. And I think this list demonstrates not only my dad's eclectic interests, but also the difficulty in actually honing in on a topic each year. And as such, I want to thank the committee who dedicated themselves to finding the right topics and speakers over the past 5 years. I know that the discussions were not easy. It is not simple to come to a consensus, and I appreciate each of you giving of your time to properly memorialize my father. I'd like each of you to stand. I know it's kind of awkward, but you're going to stand up so we can recognize you. Martha Himmelfarb, if you are here in the room. Bob Goldenberg. Stan Katz, Michael Walzer, Julie Roth, My sister Shifra Diamond, who is on the train and she's standing up, waiting to get off the train, so she knew to stand up at the right time. And my mother, Judy Diamond. Now, picking a topic and a speaker is all well and good, but if there's no money to pay for the speaker, the venue, the invitations, the food, etc., we would get nowhere. And so therefore, I want to thank the many people who helped support this lecture series with your large and small donations to make this happen. I'm not going to name individual names because I will inevitably leave someone out, but I will say, in the style of airline flight attendants, that we know there are many worthy causes to support with your philanthropic dollar, and we appreciate that you chose this lecture series to support. So, thank you. I want to thank my sisters Shifra and Gila and my uncle Gary for being the introductory speakers at the previous lectures and for sharing their memories of my father as they were related to the different topics. And finally, I want to thank everyone who's traveled to this event today and for the lectures in previous years. And here I sound like a little bar mitzvah boy thanking his relatives and friends coming from out of town, but the reality is that we actually have a really nice turnout for this fifth and final lecture. So, everyone who is related to my father in some way and who does not live in the greater Princeton metropolitan area, I'd like you to stand up. Family relations. Miriam and Rob. Okay, thank you. You could stay standing if you'd like. Everyone who is a non-Princetonian friend, so that is you're not a relative, but you don't live in Princeton and you came for this visit. There's a few of you, I know. I know you're in the crowd, so stand up. Thank you. And, of course, everyone the local Princetonians who might not have traveled so far but have taken your time from your day to join us. And you should stand up, too. So, Oliver, come on, stand up. There you go. I really appreciate it, and I know it means a lot to my mother that everyone is here. Now, much has happened since March 28th, 2013. We all think for a moment where our own personal lives have changed over the past 5 years. In the broader world scene, I'm just going to list a few things that would have been important to my father. The American political landscape has undergone a slight transformation since then. The Chicago Cubs won a World Series. The Washington Capitals won a Stanley Cup. The Israeli Prime Minister is still Benjamin Netanyahu. So, and in our family, I'd say the most dramatic changes have happened among the 6 Diamond grandchildren. We have two of you are here, and what I say here will represent your cousins. Jordan graduated, since 2013, Jordan graduated high school, started and graduated Worcester College, and is now working in New York for Major League Baseball. Rebecca graduated high school and is now in her second year in the studio for interrelated media at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design in Boston. Eli finished high school. He studied in yeshiva for 2 years and is now in his second year of an electrical engineering degree at the Technion in Haifa. Daughter Shira finished high school, spent a year in Midrashah, and is now serving in the Israeli Navy in a surveillance and monitoring unit. David finished middle school, started high school, and will graduate this year and head off to college. And Avi started and finished middle school and is now in grade 10 in a yeshiva high school in Jerusalem. Now, although none of you have had the opportunity to have Grandpa Jim be there to support and encourage you as you have begun to carve out paths for yourselves, the 6 of you, and perhaps more than anyone else in this room, have the daunting yet exciting opportunity to carry on Grandpa's legacy. It's daunting because, well, he was Grandpa, and he had a pretty impressive legacy. But exciting because, as noted earlier, he had so many interests, and there is undoubtedly something from his rich life as a serious Jew and a not-so-serious person that is bound to connect you to him. We don't expect you to be exactly like him, and we probably don't want you to be exactly like him, but we hope that you will keep a piece of him with you as you continue your own journey ahead. Which brings me to today's lecture by Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs. Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs is the director of research at the Agnon House in Jerusalem, director of Atid, the Academy for Torah Initiatives and Directions, and also webyeshiva.org. He is an associate editor of the journal Tradition and series editor of the SY Agnon Library at the Toby Press. He's written extensively on Jewish education, thought, literature, and more. He also happens to be a neighbor of Judy and myself in Efrat. Judy and I moved to Efrat in August 2011. Jeff's son, Shalom, was in class with our son, Eli, and then we discovered that Lonnie, Jeff's wife, had been on the one-year program at Hebrew University with Judy. We were sitting around a lovely Shabbat lunch at the Sachs house, and I noticed a bookshelf full of Agnon volumes. I said, "What's with the Agnon books?" I asked, and he explained his interest in the Hebrew author. I said, "You should meet my dad," and I explained, my dad's interest in Agnon and the translation project that was going on with the late Alan Mintz. Well, it turns out they had already made a connection and had already begun a little bit of a conversation. And I went after Shabbat. I sent an email. Hey, guess who we happened to have had lunch with? And then my parents came to visit that winter, and he and Jeff hit it off and began a friendship that made up in quality that did not unfortunately lacked in duration. And the joke became in our house that when they would come to visit, they actually weren't coming to visit us. The grandkids would say, "We're not coming to visit, coming to visit, hang out with Jeff." That was the case. So while Judy and I would take some credit for Jeff being here, the fact is this is what my father was all about. Somebody who could find the point of connection with somebody he meets, had an intellectual relationship, and they formed a strong personal bond that blossomed into a lasting friendship. 5.5 years ago at the funeral, I spoke of how Moses was not allowed to enter the promised land after leading the Israelites through the desert for 40 years. And I spoke about how my father connected to this point that you don't always get to finish what you start. 2 days from now, on Shabbat, we will read the Torah portion, Lech Lecha, which tells of God promising the land of Israel to Abraham and his descendants. In chapter 15, we read of the covenant between God and Abraham, the covenant of the parts, or what we call in Hebrew, Brit Bein HaBetarim. In this covenant, God promises that Abraham's descendants will go down into exile and be enslaved for 400 years, and then they'll leave the slavery with great wealth. And then stuck in the middle of this, there's a verse, almost as an aside, that God tells Abraham that he'll die, and then only afterwards, the next verse says that the fourth generation will return to the land that God promises to them. In other words, God is telling Abraham, you'll see the start of this wonderful project called the Jewish people and the land of Israel, but you won't get to see it finished. Today, Jeff will be speaking about a project that my father saw the start of, but was unable to see its finished. The title of the talk, From the City of the Dead to a City in its Fullness, Between Tragedy and Nostalgia in the Long Agnonian Arc. Agnon was one such journey, but as this 5-year lecture series has shown, my father had many journeys. And in the audience today are family and friends with whom he started on these journeys, but who unfortunately have been left to finish it without him. As with Agnon, our challenge is to neither wallow in the tragedy of what happened to my father, nor to be stuck in the nostalgia about who he was. Rather, we should keep in mind his life in its fullness. And in doing so, may we all merit the opportunity to help finish what he started, and may we each find our own journeys that carry his legacy forward in the years ahead. Thank you. Rabbi Sachs.
Thank you all very much. I feel both pride and a tinge of sorrow to be here. Pride for the honor of being invited to Princeton, sorrow for the great man who we gather to honor this evening. Thank you very much to the family and to the organizers and to my hosts and to the very many old friends and relatives that made the trek to be with us today. Since we're here speaking about a Nobel laureate in Princeton, I recalled the work of another Princetonian Nobel laureate. That would be Professor Steven Weinberg, whose 1977 physics book, not literature, The First 3 Minutes, described the origin and evolution of the physical universe, and in ways that I don't really pretend to understand. There's a reason people go into Torah study and literature. He describes how in the first 3 minutes after the Big Bang, all of the material structure of the universe. All of those protons and neutrons came into being and populate the universe until today. Rarely can the roots of literary or artistic creations be analyzed with the same kind of precision. Things just don't work that way in the artistic process. The muse comes when it does. We are consumers of culture. We read the novel, we see the film, we observe the painting, and we can't uncover those moments of creation. We can never be witness to the Big Bang that gives us the great American novel or Hebrew literature, which a committee in Stockholm will take note of. We can only consume the object as it is. However, careful examination of one particular unknown work by Agnon, a short story which you're holding actually now in a just translation that I've prepared, gives us the kind of insight to those first few moments, the early raw material of Agnon, from which he then drew and reconstructed the building blocks with which he crafted his art over 6 decades that he was active as a writer, up until 1966, when he stands on the stage receiving the Nobel Prize. I presume a word about Agnon is in order. Although we were all, of course, devotees of Jim, some of us were his students in his many other fields and interests, as Eitan had pointed out. S.Y. Agnon, his birth name was Shmuel Yosef Chachkis, was born, everybody chuckles at the idea that there's a Jew named Chachkis, was born in the little town of Buczacz, which today is in western Ukraine, but in his lifetime was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, part of Galicia. You know, there are Galician Jews. There is such a thing. He grows up in a completely traditional environment of the cheder, the Jewish schoolhouse, of the Beit Midrash, the study hall. But he's exposed to a whole variety of things, to literature, to world literature, which was already available to him in translations to Yiddish and even to Hebrew. And as a very young man, as a young teenager, his first publication is 14 years old, he sets himself to being a writer. In 1908, at the age of 20, he heads off on Aliyah, which was something unconventional in Galicia. During the second Aliyah, that wave of immigration leading up to World War I, he was largely a Russian endeavor. But he heads off, he lands in Yafo, where, like almost every young man of the second Aliyah, he removes his yarmulke, he abandons traditional observance, and he becomes, if not exactly a pioneer working the land, then a member of the kind of cultural elite of the land of Israel at that time, publishing stories almost immediately. His first publication upon arriving in the land of Israel, from which point he abandons writing in Yiddish. Until then, he'd been writing and publishing in Hebrew and Yiddish. He abandons Yiddish as the language of the exile and commits himself only to the holy tongue of Hebrew. He publishes a short story called Agunot, Abandoned Wives, which he signs with the pen name Agnon, Agnon to resonate with this theme Agunot. And from that point on, it becomes both his pen name and, as was the fashion in those days for people named Chachkis to Hebraize their name, it becomes his actual name. And his star quickly rises, and he becomes recognized as the up-and-coming great man of Hebrew letters. Figures such as the secular saint Yosef Chaim Brenner and the great religious master Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook recognize him as making a significant contribution to Jewish and Hebrew culture in those early years. 1912, he goes for what's meant to be a kind of extended sojourn to Germany, where he wants to round out his experience, his education. He had no secular education. Experience the world in the way that one must do in order to become a top-draw literary man. World War I breaks out. That, of course, prevents him from returning to the land of Israel. He meets a nice girl. He gets married. He settles down. He comes under the patronage of Shlomo Zalman Shokin, the very wealthy German Jewish business magnate who supports him throughout the rest of his life, so he's able to commit himself to the work of artistry without having to worry about making a living. Excuse me. 1924, his house is destroyed in a fire, along with his library of many of thousands of books, and the nearly finished manuscripts of 2 books, which he had forgotten to back up on the cloud. And he says, that's it, this is a sign. It is time to return to Eretz Yisrael. And the family resettles, this time in Jerusalem, ultimately in the house, which still exists in Talpiot, where he lived for the last 40 years of his life, writing the classics of Hebrew literature. That is Beit Agnon, the Agnon house in the Talpiot neighborhood, which you are all welcome to visit next time you're visiting Jerusalem. 1966, he gets the call. He's been recognized. He becomes Israel's first Nobel laureate in anything. He becomes Hebrew literature's only Hebrew laureate until this very day. In his adolescence, writing in Hebrew and in Yiddish, prior to his departure in 1908, we can see the kinds of protons and neutrons that he will later recycle in his award-winning stories and novels. But all of the writing that he did prior to departing Europe at age 20, all of which appeared in the very, very many Jewish, Hebrew, and Yiddish newspapers that sprouted like mushrooms after the rain all over Europe, he left behind. Except for 3 very, very small pieces, none of that writing is later anthologized in the collected writings, although there are themes that are recycled. It's as if a great author is inducted into the Library of America and his collected writings are put together. It's not going to include the essays that he wrote in the high school newspaper. And Agnon understood this, and he understood the shortcomings of what he had written before. He was, in fact, rather self-conscious of the shortcomings of the work. He was a young man whose ambition was only outstripped by his talent, but he was nevertheless an adolescent. And as an adult, he understood what he was doing. He actually recycled one poem. Early in life, he wrote a bit of poetry. Later, he understood that this was not his strength, and he committed himself to prose. But in his 1939 novel, the novel that the Nobel Committee recognized as the height of his achievement, a novel called A Guest for the Night, Oreach Natal Alun, this very bittersweet, tragic, nostalgic return of an adult author from Jerusalem to his hometown, not of Buczacz, but of the fictionalized Shibush. Shibush in Hebrew means mixed up, muddled, broken down. He depicts his hometown on the eve of World War II as being decrepit. It's deteriorated on all accounts, spiritually, physically, economically, emotionally. The town is a wreck. It was tragically prescient because the novel was published at the beginning of September 1939. There were other things going on in the world at the beginning of September 1939. If you read the novel today without knowing when it was written and originally published, you might imagine that, in fact, he must have written it after World War II about what the town was like on the eve of World War II, as if to say, we knew what was coming. But in fact, it was already published the year before the war breaks out, serially in the newspaper, and then as a novel at the beginning of 1939. And this guest, this eponymous guest of The Guest for the Night, this townsman who returns back to the old hometown, in a way very similar to Thomas Wolfe's almost contemporaneous novel, You Can't Go Home Again, returns to the hometown having gone off to the land of Israel and become a celebrated author. And he spends the better part of a year documenting what he sees in town. And he encounters one of the main characters, a fellow called Yerucham. In Hebrew, he's called Yerucham Chofshi. The translator calls him Yerucham Freedman because he has freed himself of the yoke of the mitzvot. But Yerucham remembers this character, the guest, from when he had last lived in town, and he'd been a poet, and his work had inspired all the young men. Yerucham begins to declaim the guest, meaning Agnon, early writing. And he says, Yerucham placed his two hands on his heart, repeated melodiously, "Devotion faithful unto death, I've sworn to thee by God above. For all I have in exile here, I'll give Jerusalem for thy love." The translator has taken liberties to preserve the rhyme, but in the Hebrew it's kind of cheesy rhymes, Yerushalayim and Shamayim, Kodesh and Chodesh. The guest says, "If you're not silent, I'll leave you and go," I said to Yerucham. He paid no heed, but recited, "And though the tomb may close me in with all the dead beneath the ground, in deepest pit thou art my strength, O fortress, city, world-renowned." "I know you don't like this poem," said Yerucham. "Your taste has improved and you're sick of rhyming. God above, Jerusalem's love, Shamayim, Yerushalayim." This is an actual poem that young Tchotchkes had published in the newspaper at the age of 16. And now the mature author recycles it to his own horror as the kind of cheesy adolescent rhyme that he's now embarrassed of. His dismissal of his adolescent writing aside, there is value in looking at these materials that he left behind, not all of which are available to us. Many of them were published under a whole variety of pseudonyms, and presumably there's material available in archives or on microfilm that were written by the later Nobel laureates that remain anonymous. But for our purposes, a short story, it's even hard to call it a story, it doesn't fit into a specific genre, published in March 1907 in the short-lived Lvov, Lemberg newspaper Ha'et, is very instructive. The story is called Ir HaMetim, the City of the Dead. It has been largely unknown and completely unavailable to readers until being unearthed very recently by myself and published a few weeks ago in Hebrew and now prepared for your purposes here in English. It's signed with the pen name Echad Min Ha'ir, one of the city, which I presume was a pseudonym chosen for its resonance with the other great Jewish author, Echad Ha'am, one of the nation. Had young Tchotchkes gone into the family fur trade or become a rabbi, as his father and grandfather might have preferred, or if, God forbid, the ship carrying him to Jaffa in 1908 had not reached its port of call, we would little note nor long remember this particular piece of writing. Its value is not in its literary merits. Its significance comes from the insight it gives us to those first 3 minutes, to the raw material that he will go on to polish, arrange, rearrange, explore, re-explore, look at as a young man and then come back to it in middle age and in old age in that way that you see things differently. Agnon once said that any story not worth reading twice probably wasn't worth reading the first time. In the English edition, in the New English edition to Agnon's great novel, A Simple Story, which was published in this series that I edited, I wrote a foreword in which I described first encountering the story as a young man, as a sophomore in college, a junior in college, on the heels of a terrible heartbreak. You know, the kind of heartbreak you can only experience when you're a junior in college. It's a story of star-crossed love. It's a story of heartbreak. It's actually a story of this young Herschel Hurwitz, citizen of Shibush, this same town, Agnon's hometown. Boy meets girl, boy falls in love with girl, boy can't have girl for a variety of reasons, and a kind of descent into madness and ascent into healing. And quite by coincidence, not knowing what the book was about, I encountered it in the college bookstore, having read a bit of Agnon at that point already, and I began reading it. So in the foreword, I described what it was like to encounter this book in my 20s, and then to reread it again in my 30s, already a happily married man with children. It's a very different book. And then again in your 40s, and so on and so forth. And that's the test of all great literature. And this we see here when we look at the raw material, the early writings, how he depicts a story, and then how he himself, not as a reader of the work, sees things differently, but as the author of the work, comes back to it not as an adolescent, but in middle age, in old age, how he will tell the story of his town as a 19-year-old in 1907 is going to be very different than how he tells the story of his town in the 1960s, with the knowledge that the town and its entire population had been wiped out in the Holocaust. But we also see the incredible development of the artist as a young man. Again, the literary merits of this story are not significant. They're not spectacular. But 18 months later, he's already arrived in Jaffa and pens that first story, Agunot, which to this day remains a high watermark of Hebrew literature. And one wonders what caused such accelerated maturation in the artist as a young man, aside from the proverbial heir of the land of Israel, right? How did he go through this transformation in order to break upon the literary scene in Jaffa in such a way? In 1907, young Tchotchkes had answered the call of the Ha'et newspaper. The editor was a man named Gershom Beder, to go to become the associate editor of this newspaper in Lemberg. Buczacz is a town. It's not exactly a shtetl, but it's a small town. Lemberg, Lvov, is the capital of Galicia. It's the big city. And the 19-year-old heads off, like so many people come off to college today, and he's working, he's employing himself as a man of letters. It's a small newspaper, 8 pages each issue. It was published 3 times a week. He, as associate editor, assistant editor, probably wrote a lot of the copy himself, but did so under a whole variety of pen names. In other words, every single article is written by the same person. It doesn't look like a very serious operation. So the few people that worked in the newspaper would publish under a whole variety of pseudonyms. Unfortunately, this newspaper was not long for the world. And after only 3 months, only 20 issues, it went bust. And he had to return back home, Passover 1907, with his tail between his legs, a failure, unpaid for his efforts. But that journey to Lemberg changed his life, because he saw that he envisioned himself as a writer, as somebody involved in this professionally, and it must have been very difficult to return to the little provincial town he was from after having been off in the big city. And it's not surprising that within less than a year, he once again has packed his bags and headed off, this time for the land of Israel. The newspaper itself hardly remains. It was a rather insignificant run of 20 issues, and it would have disappeared from view, unlike some other Hebrew or Yiddish newspapers that were going concerns, that are the source of historical research, that are preserved in many libraries on microfilms. Ha'et hardly exists. The first person to take note of it was the scholar, the great Agnon scholar Arnold Band from UCLA, who 57 years after the story was first published came to know about it because Agnon brought it to his attention. And Agnon told him at the time that the story was published, this description of the town, and it's Agnon's first literary description of his own town, it had caused quite a stir, quite a controversy back in the little town. In Band's large book, the most significant, to this day it remains the most significant work of literary criticism on the fullest work of criticism on Agnon's work, Band's book called Nostalgia and Nightmare. He makes mention of this story in passing, and he quotes a little bit from the opening lines. But besides that, nobody else had access to the story. Band saw it in the 1960s because Agnon still had a copy of the whole run of Ha'et, which is bound in a kind of binding altogether, and Agnon indicated which were the stories that he had written. But the story itself was never republished. That volume of Agnon's personal copy of the newspaper still survives and is in the National Library, but it's uncatalogued, so researchers are unaware of it. And thanks to my friend and mentor, Mr. Ravi Weiser, the legendary, those of you that have done work in the National Library in Jerusalem will know that name. He's the legendary archivist and the former head of the Agnon archives in Jerusalem. I came to know that at least one copy still existed, and I came into possession of this story. This was in the days when Jim was still with us. In the months before the tragic events of 5 years ago, Jim and Judy spent about 2 months in Yerushalayim. Jim and I had been working together on a variety of projects, and I think, as Rabbi Roth pointed out, he really was someone whose intellectual passions were bridled to his profoundly human love of other people, of other Jews, and of the very, very, very many unlikely turns my life has taken. My friendship, my chavruta with Jim Diamond was really, truly one of the most rewarding and surprising. There was so much, obviously, that separated us. A generation, religious affiliations, background. He lived here, I lived there. None of that mattered. Once Jim found a chavruta, somebody he could teach and learn from and learn with, that was all that mattered. It was a chavruta in the most authentic sense of that charged Jewish word. People thinking together, learning from each other, arguing with each other, debating ideas, trying to unpack what they mean for our lives. And in one of the last, if not the last, emails that I received from him, you can see the date. It was just 2 weeks before the accident. We had been sitting in Jerusalem talking about the story. I had given him a copy to ask him what he thought. And this is after they've returned back home. Shalom Jeff. Well, we're back and fully toggled over to Princeton mode after having been in Jerusalem for 2 months. It's good to be back in one's own living space and to see the smiling faces of the books on the shelves around me, welcoming me back. We have missed each other. I've reviewed Ir HaMetim, the City of the Dead, and conclude that it is a very significant text. It deserves an article. Have you thought of writing one to explicate its importance? I would encourage you to consider doing that. The article, as I envision it, would feature the text of Ir HaMetim and would consist of a commentary on it. The points it would make would be, as you say, that Agnon saw himself as a chronicler of Buczacz already at the age of 19. His development and later stories of several motifs and events told in the piece show that he's carried around what became Irum Loa, a city in its fullness, in his head virtually all his life, which points to the centrality of a city in its fullness as the foundation on which his entire oeuvre rests, which point is confirmed by what Agnon's daughter and executor, Emuna Yaron, has to say about a city in its fullness, that it is really, truly his most significant work. And then he goes on to talk about the importance of republishing this story and what it might mean for Agnon scholarship and for his work, which he had drawn me into with the late Professor Alan Mintz, Zichrono Livracha. The three of us working together on these stories of a city in its fullness, the fact that I alone am here to tell the tale is, again, a source of sorrow. The three books that came out of these conversations, The Parable and Its Lesson, the long story that Jim had translated and annotated with Alan's critical introduction, A City in Its Fullness, Agnon's great magnum opus, his great posthumous work. Throughout the last 2 decades of his life, Agnon had been at work on a book called Ir Umloa, which we translate as A City in Its Fullness, which was meant to be a kind of literary history, not actual history with a capital H the way it's practiced in a history department here in Princeton and other universities, but an imaginative history through the work of fiction, which would include actual historical material, folklore, local tales and legends, to preserve 300 years of the story of his town in stories. The longest piece in the collection is A Parable and Its Lesson, which was published first as a standalone volume. And then together, Jim was working on translating the other stories of the collection. Unfortunately, what happened, and he didn't complete the project. Thanks to Judy, we were able to get the files with the drafts of his translation, which I was modestly able to help complete, and then drafting a team of other translators to finish off the work. And then Alan Mintz's companion volume of literary analysis of those stories, which was published, again, all of this tragic timing, days before his own tragically early death, called Ancestral Tales, reading the Buczacz stories of S.Y. Agnon. This little story, the story that you're holding now in translation, The City of the Dead, is the beginning point from which we can trace the long arc that ends in the city in its fullness. It contains references to a whole variety of stories, many of which appear in this posthumous volume. The Hebrew version of A City in Its Fullness, Irum Loa, was published only in 1973, 3 years after Agnon's death. At the time that it was published, it was largely overlooked. It had the bad fortune of being published on the eve of the Yom Kippur War. Hebrew readers were distracted. But it also was published at a time when the Hebrew readership was no longer so interested in reading stories of the old world. Hebrew literature had moved on. It was documenting the Sabra experience, the generation that established a state. In 1973, there was already some very good fiction coming out that was documenting the experiences of the Six-Day War, and then later the Yom Kippur War itself, and a whole variety of other experiences that the Israeli reading public could relate to more immediately. It's only in the last decade that critical attention has been refocused on Agnon's stories of the old world, and part of that credit goes to Jim and to Alan Mintz and to other people as well. But a whole variety of stories that may be familiar to readers of Agnon. Va'yakov l'mishor, the crooked shall be made straight. Hanidach, the banished, the outcast. Agadat HaSofer, the tale of the scribe, and many others that may be known to those of you that still read Agnon, their roots can be seen in the city of the dead. Ir HaMeitim, the city of the dead, begins with a description of the earliest Jewish graves in the town, and the omnipresence of death runs throughout the whole piece written in 1907. It's a kind of macabre point of pride that Jews are literally dying to get into Buczacz. You're welcome to take the story home and read it at your own pace. We won't go through it together. But the obsession with graves as a sign of Buczacz's death urge, leading up to the type of eternal memorialization. You understand that gravestones, that's what they are, is this idea that the history, the bedrock history, the basis of the connection of the residents with the town is in the graveyard. And these ideas are recycled back in A City in its full, in A Guest for the Night, when the guest is talking with a particular character, an old friend who had remained in the town, named Schutzling. It's the tragedy of my life that I don't live in Shibush, meaning Buczacz. The guest replies, do you love Shibush so much? When a man sees that there is no place in the world that he loves, he deceives himself into thinking he loves his town. And you, do you love Shibush? I haven't thought about it yet. My friend took my hand and said, if so, let me tell you that all your love for the land of Israel comes to you from Shibush. Because you love your town, you're able to love the land of Israel. How do you know that I love Shibush? Is it proof you want? If you did not love Shibush, would you be dealing with it all your life? Would you be digging up gravestones to discover their secrets? And this idea, we do this. We all do this. We travel places, you go. I spent part of the summer in Ukraine. It was actually my first visit back to Agnon's hometown and to so many other places. It's a Jewish thing. We go, we visit grave sites, right? The idea that this is somehow bedrock, it reconnects us. But the idea that the town itself is kind of riddled with death. He makes reference to actual halachic material. And here we see the very first evidence of what Agnon would do again and again and again. He looks at the rabbinic literature that was composed in Buczacz. And for a small town, Buczacz had a remarkably deep bench of rabbinic figures that spent time often passing through until they got a more weighty appointment in a larger town, but the rabbinic literature that's composed in Buczacz. So in the responsa called Hesed Lavra Ham by Rabbi Avraham ben Tzvi Hirsch Teumim, who dies in 1868 and had been the rabbi in Buczacz for the last 15 years of his life, we find a whole variety of responsa about Kohanim, the priestly class who can't defile themselves by going into a cemetery, and the problem of navigating the streets of Buczacz. Sometimes they're riddled with graves. Every time they dig up the street in order to repave it, they discover another grave. And it's unclear if this is a Jewish grave or a non-Jewish grave, because part of the local folklore is that the Jews had been here since antiquity. This is not historically true. The earliest Jews arrive in Buczacz in the 16th century. But local imagination makes a claim that we've been here since antiquity, a variation of that old folk tale about how the Jews get to Poland. They're traveling from Germany to get to the land of Israel. But it's a long journey, and sometimes the snow is very deep, and you can't keep moving on. And a heavenly voice calls out and tells them, Po Lin, reside here, which is, of course, why the country is called Poland, because Poland is a wordplay on the Hebrew that the heavenly voice had called out to say, Jews, reside here until it will be time for your ultimate ingathering to the land of Israel. So this idea that the Jews have this ancient claim raises halachic questions, because if the town is riddled with graves, what about all of the Kohanim that can't be defiled? And these are all addressed in the actual halachic responsa of Rav Te'umim. And Agnon takes the halachic material as raw material for crafting a piece of literature. But this idea that the characters know that the bedrock of the town lies in the cemetery. Now, he's writing this in 1907. He can't possibly imagine what ultimately would be the fate of the city. But it's a little eerie to us who stand on the other side of history to think that, in fact, that was the case. This is the Buczacz cemetery today. The day before I arrived, a group of students that have been going around Eastern Europe from the Mechlelet Herzog in Alon Shvut, very near where we live. Every summer they go to a different Jewish cemetery and they clear it out and they catalog it. The cemetery in Buczacz had been largely overtaken by the nearby forest, which had grown in, and only a portion of it was accessible. But they cut back and they cataloged, and on the day before I was there in August, the grave of Agnon's mother was discovered. His father's grave had been known for a while. Very interestingly, the custom in Buczacz must have been not to bury families together, not to bury husbands and wives together, but to bury people in the order that you could see the dates. People got buried, you got buried next to the guy that died the day before you. So this is Agnon's mother's grave. You can see there on the top, Chachkis, right? Esther Chachkis. The story goes on to describe Ir HaMeitim, that to this day there is a street called by everyone Schulgasse, the Shul Alley, Shul Row, Synagogue Street, even though there is no sign of Jews or Judaism there. In fact, when a Jew wishes to remove himself from the community, he rents a house on that street. Now, in fact, this appears in a whole variety of Agnon's stories. In a simple story in the prime of her life, there are characters that kind of live on the periphery of town. A character that might not fit in normative Jewish society for one reason or another goes off to live in this non-Jewish section of town. It's a town with a majority of Jews, but this is the non-Jewish section of town. But the irony is that the name of the street is Synagogue Street. So obviously there must have been some ancient synagogue there when the street got its name. In fact, yet it's reported that once a grand synagogue stood there. The church, but today, that what must have been a synagogue has been desecrated and has now become a church. And how do we know this? In other words, there's this place where no Jews live. And nobody even remembers that Jews had ever lived there. But there's a church there. But because the name of the street is Synagogue Street, it must be that church building, obviously, how does the imagination work? Right? How does the Jewish imagination work? We have to find an explanation for this. Obviously, this church building must have once been a synagogue, and it's been desecrated. And how can you tell? Because the walls are at a slant. The building has begun to deteriorate. Right? One of the church walls is at a slant and is the remnant of the synagogue upon which their church is built. The wall stoops in great sorrow and mourning for the desecration of its holiness. And this particular slanting church, once a synagogue, makes cameo appearances throughout all of Agnon's Buczacz writing. There's another element in A City of the Dead that describes the origins of the Fedor Hill. On the opposite side of the river Stripa, which runs through the town, there's a large hill called Fedor. Fedor is a Ukrainian nickname, or the Ukrainian pronunciation for the name Theodore. So he crafts this fable, this kind of Judaized Icarus myth of a builder of the most grand structure in Buczacz, the town hall, which still exists today, which had been commissioned by the Polish overlords, that how could it be in our Jewish town, this grand architectural structure, which is the wonder of all of Eastern Galicia, has no Jewish connection? So it must be that the architect who built it was really secretly a Jew. And when he's done constructing the town hall, the overlord, this Count Potocki, the Polish nobility owned the lands throughout what today is Ukraine. So this Count Potocki was the owner of Buczacz. The former governor of New York, Pataki, is a descendant of this family. He locks the architect in the top of the tower so that he'll be unable to go and build a grand structure like this in any other town. The architect, with the loose building materials that are still there, fashions for himself a set of wings and flies to his freedom in a Judaized Icarus myth. He's shot down and dies on the hill across the river called the Fedor Hill, right? Which is why, since his name was Theodore, that's why the locals called it Fedor Hill. And it becomes this kind of center of martyrdom. Because of his act, it consecrates the hill for later acts of martyrdom. Now, this is a very kind of very eerie foreshadowing, because in fact, in the Holocaust, almost 40 years after Agnon writes this, 13,670 Jews were murdered and buried in mass graves on this Fedor Hill. So he obviously could not have known that. But we, now with our knowledge, look at this and puzzle at how history and literature intersect in all kinds of complicated ways. What's interesting in A City in Its Fullness is the almost complete lack of the intertextual work that Agnon becomes famous for. That's the hallmark. That's almost the very subject of Agnon's writing. His achievement as an author, as a Jewish author, as a Hebrew author, was taking the entirety of the Jewish canon, the entirety of the Jewish bookshelf, from the Bible, through the Midrash, through the writings of Chazal, the rabbinic sages, the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Talmud, the medieval Hebrew writing, medieval Hebrew poetry, the writing of the Jewish Enlightenment, Hasidic tales, the entire span of Jewish writing, taking all of it, distilling it, and then pouring it into the mold of modern literature in a way that all of his works are both drawing on that and in dialogue with the classical sources. This adolescent work does not show that hallmark, which would later become so synonymous with what it means to read Agnon. The significant intratextual element in the story is how the story ends. The conclusion of the story, which again you have in front of you, is a few paragraphs, a rough draft of a story that we will recognize as Yekele. Now, I know that they had distributed this story to a number of people. I saw that some people had actually, somebody came over to tell me that they'd done the homework, that they'd read it, so this will not affect your final grade. But they had distributed, and those of you that will be interested to read afterwards, there are two stories titled Yekele. Yekele is a Yiddish nickname for Yaakov, for Jacob. There are two stories in A City in Its Fullness called Yekele. They were not published in Agnon's lifetime. When his daughter was taking the material that he had been working on towards this book, A City in Its Fullness, Ir Umlo'ah, and at the end of his life under his instruction, and then after his death on her own, she found the manuscripts to two stories. They're both titled Yekele, with no other indication. Unfortunately, Agnon never dated his manuscripts. He gives no indication which came first, which came second. Some think that these two stories, they're the same story told from different perspectives. Some suggest it's a kind of Rashomon, you know, that famous Japanese film where one story is told from 4 different perspectives. She didn't know what to do, so she published both of them. She titled one of them Yekele Nusach Echad, Yekele one version, and the other she titles Yekele Nusach Acher, another version. Readers generally, therefore, assume that the second, the other version, is the revised. The first is the first draft, the second is the second draft. And in fact, when we were working on the book, Jim translated the 2 stories, and it's worth reading the stories just to see what a skillful, felicitous translator he was. And those of you that can read the Hebrew, to read them side by side, to see the very many creative and artistic choices he made. We styled the 2 stories Yekele 1 and Yekele 2, which further reinforces the idea that there's a sequence here, that Yekele 1 is the first draft and Yekele 2 is the second. I now understand that that was a mistake, because in light of what we have, the kernel of the story in the 1907 version, you can trace the arc of development. It's clear to me that in the 1960s, when he sits down to write the Yekele stories, he had that bound edition of Ha'et newspaper in front of him, and he was going back to this material from almost 50, 60 years earlier in order to rework it as a full story. In the 1907 version of the story, here's the Hebrew in front of us, we read the following. It's the very end of the story if you want to follow along. One of the founders of Hasidism in town was a learned Torah scholar, the father of the man Yekele, who was eventually executed by hanging at the command of the head of the community. This Yekele, son of the first Hasid in town, was executed 82 years ago. That would be 1825. Having been charged on suspicion of theft and found guilty. At the moment they brought him up to the gallows, the hangman, who was an apostate Jew from Chernovitz, said to him, "Make confession in the name of the God of Israel." He confessed many misdeeds, but denied any responsibility regarding this theft. A moment before they slipped the noose around his neck, he declared that he had not committed this sin. In fact, this man was killed because of the wrath of the communal leader, who had a gripe against him and feared him. A few days after he was hanged, a court order arrived absolving him of all punishment. But it was too late, as the deed was done. On the day they took Yekele to the gallows, all the townsmen left the city, wandered the fields and forests in tears, stretched out their hands toward heaven and cried out, "Our hands have not shed this blood." Now the final line in the Hebrew text reads, that the final line in the text reads that they even had wanted to bring the Egla Arufa, the broken-necked calf, which is, of course, a ceremony described in Deuteronomy chapter 21, that if a murdered body is found in town, the city elders perform this ceremony on the outside the town limits in order to absolve their hands, to wipe their hands, as if to say, our hands have not shed this blood. In the print edition, the one print edition that survives in the National Library, in Agnon's own hand, he had put parentheses around the final sentence, and he adds in his handwriting, Ze Hosif Ha'orech. You can see it better here. The editor added this. The final line was not penned by him. Agnon had a lifelong, and you can see it already still as a teenager, a lifelong animosity towards editorial intervention in his work. But he would have particularly been disturbed by this because it's what he would have considered amharatzus, Jewish ignorance. Because in fact, the Mishnah already states that the Egla Arufa ceremony had been abrogated. And in all cases, it was a mitzvah that was never in force outside of the land of Israel. In other words, his commitment to the authenticity of the Jewish life and law that he was depicting in literature was paramount. He would have never written something that would not have resonated as halachically authentic. Now, this does not mean he does not portray Jews sinning, right? He does. That's the stuff of literature. But it has to be authentic within the description of the Jewish reality that he's describing. This passage is a précis. It's a summary of the later Yekela stories. If you take the time to read those Yekela stories, which we will not unpack here, you'll see how he expands them in two different directions. The major difference is that the anonymous communal head who's trying to neutralize this whippersnapper, Yekele, and ends up getting the non-Jewish authorities involved until they execute him, which is a handy way, I guess, of getting rid of somebody that you don't want to have around, becomes a character named Yisrael Shlomo. Now, Yisrael Shlomo is a very famous Agnon character. He appears in Agnon's long, significant novel, Hachnasat Kala, or The Bridal Canopy in English. He's this rather venal scoundrel of a communal leader. He's the perfect foil for an author who wants to depict what's wrong in Jewish communal leadership. The literary critic Dan Miron says that this Yisrael Shlomo is the most vivid and interesting character and one of the best portrayals of a pathological narcissist in all of Hebrew literature. In The Bridal Canopy, this communal leader, this Parnas, is this kind of high-handed, thin-skinned communal leader who subjects his opponents, if they're sufficiently lower class that he can get away with it, to a whole variety of embarrassments and punishments and all types of things. And the very worst crime that anyone can commit against him is that good old-fashioned Jewish offense of chutzpah. Right? If somebody should show chutzpah to the communal leader, he will bring his power, his riches, his influence in order to bring him low. So the anonymous communal leader that allows one thing to lead to the next until this Yekele, who's kind of been a fly in his ointment, can be accused of trumped-up charges until the Austrian authorities come in and hang him, right? Takes on greater force in the Yekele stories. It's all predicated on the idea that in 1772, Poland was partitioned. Galicia, the part of southern Poland where Agnon lives, had been part of the Kingdom of Poland, but between 1772 and 1795, Russia, Prussia, and Austria had divvied it up until there is no autonomous nation called Poland until after World War I. And the section of southern Poland, which is Galicia, becomes the eastern reaches of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which brought with it great modernization and openness and great tolerance for the Jews. It's a very, very, very different environment than the Pale of Jewish settlement in Russia. But it also means that Jews had to give up a lot of the type of self-autonomy that they had in policing their own affairs. So it's a portrait of exactly how tricky things become. It's a question of how do you solve a problem like Yekele? How can a Jewish community now police a kind of insolent troublemaker? And what happens when things get a little out of control and the authorities, you know, those folks that actually do have the power to call the hangman in from Chernowitz, get involved? That's the depiction in the two Yekele stories. It's the confrontation between this Parnas, this Jewish communal leader, and this delinquent. Now that confrontation remains the focus from the few paragraphs of the 1900 the 1907, until the manuscripts. This is the manuscript of Yekele version 2, which you can see at the top is only titled. Both of them are titled Yekele. They're both written in the same hand. They're written on the same paper. Agnon had a very, very famously difficult handwriting. Yekele version 2, which I maintain is actually the first draft, contains, those of you that read it, somebody told me this morning that they had read it, contains this long catalog of every gamach, every Jewish charitable organization in town, to clothe the naked, to care for the widow, to feed the orphan, to educate children, to take care of birthing mothers, every single thing. Shoes for the needy, wigs for the women that can't cover their hair. Every Jewish need is taken care of in our town. And after all, our town is a town that's committed to charity and to kindness and to helping the other and to supporting Jewish life. And Agnon's not being sarcastic. In other words, he's ironic, but he's not sarcastic. When he depicts the Jewish life in its best, he's being true. But he's also showing us the degree to which those ideals are not always executed in reality. There's a gap between the ideal and the real. It's a very, very, very long list. I suspect that he takes it out of the second version because he understands it slows down the pace of the story. What's the one charitable organization that we don't have in Buczacz? Does anybody remember, those of you that read it? The one charitable organization we don't have is Pidyon Shvuyim, redeeming the captive Jews. In other words, the non-Jews would sometimes take a Jew captive, or a Jew would sometimes find himself arrested, maybe because he'd committed something which is in fact a crime under the crown. And the Jewish community would have to raise a ransom in order to free him, because we cannot leave a Jew in Gentile captivity. That's the one charitable organization we don't have. Why? Because we have something better. We have Yisrael Shlomo. We have this otherwise problematic Jewish communal leader who's very wealthy and is very, very well connected to the court. And if, God forbid, a Jew should be held captive, he can take care of it himself. Well, isn't that exactly the problem we have here? Yekele is imprisoned by the Austrian authorities because the Jewish communal leader had made a claim that he had robbed a wealthy woman and perhaps had attempted to murder her, while we, the reader, and this often happens in Agnon, we, the reader, know more about what's going on in the story than the people in the story. In Nusach Acher, and what I maintain is the first version, it's left ambivalent. In version 1, what I maintain is the actual final version. We, the reader, know that Yekele has an airtight alibi. We know that he was elsewhere on the night in question. We know what a tragedy, what a travesty this whole affair is. We know exactly how far the community's ideals are from the reality practiced. And that, yes, a very delinquent scoundrel, be he a scoundrel, is not actually a murderer. And innocent Jewish blood is spilled because of the shortcomings of the Jewish community itself. All of these differences between the two stories, a perusal of the summarized version from 1907 against the two versions later published in A City in Its Fullness, version 1 and 2, shows a very, very high correspondence of details between the 1907 version, between the 1907 version and what we called version 2. And then you see how all of the revisions between what we called version 2 and what we called version 1 are all the typical types of artistry, all the typical types of polishing, of working, of making the story tighter in order to make it more compelling. Unfortunately, I only came to understand this after it was too late. I hope that Jim in heaven is satisfied that I'm now at least correcting our mutual error. Taken as a whole, all of the foreshadowings of the stories, and this is just analysis of one, there are so many others from this early 1907 City of the Dead, they all show the evolution from adolescence to the later works. But Ir HaMetim, the City of the Dead, also shows exactly how long, over 6 decades, Agnon was carrying around his hometown with him. Even when he was still there, he understood his role as the chronicler of the town. Before the smokestacks of Auschwitz are fired up, he understands that he's in a place where death is imminent. And that's the kind of sense you get from reading A City of the Dead. A City of the Dead is also absent, also lacking the nostalgia, the very strong nostalgic voice, which can be paired together with a critical voice. Agnon maintains his criticism of that old world, just as he maintains a criticism of the new world in the land of Israel. But the nostalgia that he will come to feel for that old world is absent in the writings of a 19-year-old in 1907, because, the young people will forgive me, young people cannot feel nostalgia for the town they have not yet left. That's something that will have to come later. It's the arc from this kind of death urge to a more mature, nostalgic feel that we sense very deeply when we follow the whole story. It was a kind of authorial voice, narrative voice that was unavailable to a teenager, but one that obviously he had to develop, right? The committee in Stockholm rarely awards Nobels to adolescent authors because, with all due respect, they write like adolescents. And that doesn't always produce the kind of experience that generates world-class literature. Agnon's literary imagination was never very far away from Buczacz. It's as if you can say, and interestingly, he leaves at the age of 20, and aside from 2 very, very, very brief visits, he never returns. But he never leaves. Like so many other great authors, Mark Twain, Faulkner, Philip Roth, and others, it's as if you can take the boy out of Buczacz, but you can't take the Buczacz out of the boy. Aaron Appelfeld, the great Israeli author who passed away earlier this year, Appelfeld's appreciation for what he learned as a young author from Agnon was expressed in this way. You understand, Appelfeld was out of sync with his generation, with the other contemporary Hebrew authors who were documenting the Sabra experience. Appelfeld, who was a child of the Holocaust, continued to write novels set in the old world, or novels set in Israel that are grappling with the Holocaust. This is why it took many years for him to be fully appreciated as the great author he was. But Appelfeld writes, most of my generation of fellow authors invested a huge amount of effort into suppressing and eradicating their past. I have absolutely no complaints against them. I understand them completely. But I, for some reason, didn't know how to assimilate into the Israeli reality. Instead, I retreated into myself. For this, Agnon served as an excellent role model. It was from him that I learned how you can carry the town of your birth with you anywhere and live a full life in it. Your birthplace is not a matter of fixed geography, and you can extend its borders outward or raise them into the skies. Agnon populated his birthplace with everything the Jewish people had created in the past 200 years. Like any great writer, he wrote not literary reminiscences of his town, not what it actually was, but what it could have been. And he taught me that a person's past, even a difficult one, is not to be regarded as a defect or a disgrace, but as a legitimate source to be mined. Agnon expressed great pride in his ability to walk a very careful line in his depiction of the old world. The ability of an author to satirize or skewer or criticize does not, ipso facto, indicate his stance towards that world. That's the artistry of irony. It's actually the most Jewish form of writing. To be able to stand inside the community you love and still criticize it, and to do so from within, right? It's the message of every Purim spiel, right? The idea that we can criticize from within. He expressed this pride when he distinguished himself from the other great giants of Hebrew literature. Writing about The Bridal Canopy, his first great novel, he said, "Consider what I did with the character, the poor pauper Reb Yudel Chassid. He's this schnorrer that has to go around raising a dowry for his daughters. I created him as a person of substance, with charm after his own fashion, despite the events that befell him. What would our other writers have done with a character like this? Mendel Mocher Svarim would have made him ridiculous in order to twist and poke. Shalom Aleichem would have made him the object of simple mockery. I sweetened the bitterness of Reb Yudel's poverty, removing the ridicule, making the pauper a more perfect character." Agnon's whole career can be traced as a long arc. From the youthful, cynical, if you read The City of the Dead, it's a quite cynical portrayal, as only a teenager can depict. A cynical portrayal depicting death and decay, evolving to a more mature and creative form of writing, with tragic irony. This later voice was surely informed by the knowledge of Buczacz's final destruction. But it was already in place before the Holocaust. It was already in place by 1907. The very immature, unripe narrator of A City of the Dead had to give way to enable the formulation of the canon of Agnon's work, leading to the great culminating project of The City in its fullness. It took a sensitive, careful reader like Jim Diamond, Zichrono Livracha, to analyze Agnon's entire literary output through the lens of this late masterpiece and to present it back to us in ways that we could gain spiritual insight. As Alan Mintz, of blessed memory, had described, Agnon's work is an imaginative chronicle, an alternative to forms of memorialization that brought destruction and loss to the forefront. For Agnon, the path was not lamentation, martyrology, theodicy, or conventional forms of consolation, but the recreation in words of what was lost in fact. Thank you. I know it's rather late, but I'd be happy to entertain a question or comment or two before we turn the microphone over to Judy. I'm sorry, I cannot hear you. Ma'am, I'm sorry, I cannot hear you. Ma'am, I'm sorry. I'd be happy to speak with you privately after, but I just simply can't understand your comments. If there's a one other perhaps question or comment, and if not, I'm very happy to turn the microphone over to Judy Diamond.
I don't know how to talk into a microphone, so if you can hear me, that's good. I just want to add my personal thanks to Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs for coming here and speaking to us. I also want to say thank you to all of my friends and relatives who have come from various places around Canada and the U.S. and Israel. For this lecture and to be together after 5.5 years since Jim's untimely death. It's been kind of a long journey over the past few years, and it really, I think, a continuation of a long journey that Jim and I had together, and I think that we, traveled. Started, for those of you who don't know, in Winnipeg. And we have, just as Jeffrey was talking, gone through different phases of our lives and everything. But anyways, hopefully we can continue our conversations about Jim, about everything else outside. There will be some refreshments. Thank you very much for all of those of you who have come for 1, 2, 3, 4, or all 5 of these lectures. I think that's it. Just once again, thanks a lot, and let's rejoin outside the room, so we could talk and continue on.